Hello everybody, my name is David Johnson. I'm the Managing Director for Mont McDonald across Asia Pacific. Welcome to our series on the road to COP26. The purpose of this series was firstly to engage in rich discussion and shared goals leading up to COP26. Second, to increase general awareness around the race to net zero. And finally, to inspire those in a position of influence to do something about it. So what's this session all about? We've had two previous sessions. The first was on our regional challenges, commitments, and thoughts leading into COP26. The second was on the exciting developments in net zero buildings. And this session, and the final one in this series, will be to explore decarbonisation of the transport sector. But first up, we're going to hear from Akil Abraham. Akil is the head of climate diplomacy at the British High Commission in Canberra, leading the UK government's climate change and COP26 work here in Australia. He has previously worked as a senior advisor on political and global issues, including human rights and development. Akil has a background in law and human rights and was an advisor to the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. So over to you, Akil, to give us an update on the lead into COP26.
Thank you so much, David. And it's a real pleasure to be part of your series and all the great work Mont McDonald are doing in the decarbonisation story. So today I'm just going to give a brief overview of COP itself, the objectives of the UK government as president, and then drilling into what we're trying to do on transport as a key theme for COP26. So thanks. Next slide, Chelsea. I would like to point out, though, that this is the foreign policy priority for the UK government. Even with COVID, the need to build back better post-COVID or during COVID is intertwined with the climate crisis. And so a lot of our work this year is been focused on what steps need to be taken by government, by private sector, to create that economic growth that's tied with decarbonisation. Thanks, Chelsea. So what are our headline objectives for COP26? So these are across the pillars of the Paris Agreement, which we as president are aiming to fulfill its ambitions of. So the first one is the one that gets all the headlines around net zero and keeping the 1.5 degree warming within reach. So that requires all actors, national governments, subnational governments, corporates, to set credible targets, which includes net zero commitments by mid-century and aligned 2030 targets as well. And then there's a whole lot of sectoral work, which includes a lot of focus on the power sector, the transport sector, which I'll talk to, and then things like deforestation as well. Then the other pillars of COP26 or of the Paris Agreement are on adaptation and finance. So on the adaptation side, a lot of work helping the developing world to build defenses against disasters and to create more resilient infrastructure. On the finance side, we really need to make good on the goal that's within the Paris Agreement of $100 billion US per annum that needs to flow to developing countries. But alongside that, it's the work of the private sector, making sure every financial decision integrates climate change into their decision making. So this really is unleashing not just the billions, but the trillions in capital around the world to reach global net zero. And then finally, we have a goal for collaboration. So understanding this is not just about national governments, this is every part of society, and we all need to work together to deliver on the other goals in various groupings. Thanks, Chelsea. So that's some headline stuff, but how are we getting into the transport space or the sector space where we really need to see movement? Well, as with all technologies, there's generally an S-curve of adoption, slow, and then exponential and flattening away. These things change, from sector to sector. As you can see over there, power is probably the most advanced in terms of decarbonisation. Cars not too far behind, but some of the other parts of the transport sector, trucks, aviation, shipping, quite a bit well behind that curve. And it really is our job as COP26 president to really push ourselves past that emerging and diffusion part of this curve and into that reconfigured different society that we would live in with new technical standards and new products. Thanks, Chelsea. So that's why we're focusing on a couple of sectors within that net zero story, the ones that are really high global emitters. As you can see from this graph here, transport makes up about 14%, power 25%, nature nearly a quarter. And sitting within transport itself, a lot of the emissions come from cars and small vehicles, and then by trucks, and then less so by aviation and shipping. And we understand that to actually deliver on these results, it's not just policy settings, but that is important. It is also what are the competitive advantages in various jurisdictions, what are the financing structures, what are the connections and supply chains that exist across the global community as well. Thanks, Chelsea. And so that's why for transport specifically, we as COP presidents have a pretty fundamental goal, which is to get the trajectory of the adoption of zero emissions vehicles, both electric and hydrogen, on that net zero by 2050 pathway. And we believe this requires a doubling of the pace globally, probably a bit quicker than that here in Australia. And we understand that to needing about 100% of new car sales and van sales to be zero emissions by around 2035, possibly 2040 for some of the smaller markets. And we think that balances against what is the average timeline of some of these vehicles. And so we are really focusing on what we can do with governments there, looking at policy settings. In the UK, obviously, we have phase-out plans at 2030. We're also talking to manufacturers, making them commit or aligning them for similar sort of commitments for their production. And then we're talking to businesses as well, really at the large vehicle fleets, and trying to get them to join the EV100 initiative. So this is about fleet electrification by 2030. So we think that combination of policy settings, demand and supply will help us get to this overall objective. And I would note that COP will also have a role for some of the other transport factors as well, including trucking, green shipping, and we're also starting to look at things like zero emissions aviation. Thanks, Chelsea. So that's where we want to get to. We think this is a virtuous cycle. We think there's obviously opportunities for those that create the cars, for those that scale up these technologies. We need to create the right incentives for consumers to make costs come down. And we know that those incentives are also driven by what the signals that are sent to the market by government, by industry, general policy settings that really help shape market. So there is a role for all of us, and I would really look forward to hearing the expert panel today to talk through some of these things, I suspect, to really get onto that trajectory of net zero by 2050 and where we need to be in the transport space. Next slide, thanks, Chelsea. And so that's why our COP president really wants to see that international collaboration piece, and why sessions like today will be key. We will be able to work together to deliver those cost reductions, to innovate faster, and obviously to create economies of scale. And we think we can do all of those things in a way that will deliver economic growth and deliver on those climate objectives that I talked to in the beginning. And at COP26, I believe it's in the second week, around 10th of November, we will have a transport-specific day, so dedicated to those things I just spoke to today, and expect a lot of announcements around that and around what I've just discussed. But I'll leave it there, and back to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Akil. The leadership from the UK is amazing, and some of the aspirations you've outlined for transport are really, important globally. And I think there's a lot more to do in our part here in our region. So you talked about emissions being 14% from transportation. We think in Asia Pacific could be up to 20%. So it's a critical issue here. So achieving net zero in operations, growing the use of public transportation, increasing the efficiency of vehicle technology, and using these low carbon fuels, I'm sure will help get a shift in that and a reduction in the greenhouse emissions in the Asia Pacific area. So this session, we're going to explore pathways, challenges and solutions to decarbonising this sector. So I'd like to introduce our panellists. First of all, Lucinda Hoffman. So Lucinda is the General Manager for Transport Policy within the Department of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland. Lucinda helps shape the department's long-term vision for the transport system, which includes creating a single integrated transport network accessible to everyone. bringing Queensland closer together and effectively planning the state's future transport needs. Lucinda is leading research, development and implementation of some of the department's most innovative projects, including the electric vehicle strategy, Queensland's net zero emissions transport roadmap, and Queensland's 30-year transport strategy. So welcome, Lucinda. Second, we have Professor Walter Theresa. Walter is the Associate Professor of Economics at the Singapore University of Social Sciences and the Adjunct Senior Research Fellow for Asia Competitiveness Institute at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. His areas are applied microeconomics, behavioural and experimental economics, and he has published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and the Journal of Economic Behavioural Organisation. He consulted for the government on housing, transport and retirement policy research. He served as a nominated member of the 13th Parliament of Singapore. So welcome, Walter. So finally, we've got Jennifer Slocum. Jen is the Principal Sustainability Advisor for the Department of Infrastructure and Transport in the South Australian Government. For the past 2 years, she has been involved in the development of the government's Climate Change Action Plan and is currently working with staff, contractors and industry to implement a range of actions to reduce the emissions intensity of the public transport system. She works to align transport planning and investment frameworks with net zero goals and reduce emissions associated with the construction, operations and maintenance of government infrastructure. So welcome, Jen. So first of all, I'd like each of the panellists to give a short statement outlining their thoughts on the challenges of decarbonising this transportation sector. So first, I'd like to ask Lucinda to kick us off. I think you're on mute, Lucinda.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, fabulous. My apologies. I've had problems with my mute button. It might be a sign. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity and hello, everyone. Today I'll be talking to you from a Queensland perspective, and as hopefully you're aware, the Queensland Government is committed to reducing emissions and minimising our environmental footprint, while we're also preparing for the impacts from a warming climate. In July 2021, the Queensland Government announced the Queensland Climate Action Plan, which is a 30-year strategy with 3 targets focusing on achieving zero net emissions by 2050, powering Queensland with 50% renewable energy by 2030, and reducing emissions by at least 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. This Climate Action Plan is really a pathway forward, and it will really have ambitious but achievable climate change targets, ensuring that Queensland's industries, workers, communities can see the economic benefits from new technologies and growing markets. That's sort of the overarching strategy and plan. In terms of the department that I work for, which is the Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads, we're acutely aware that the transport sector is the second largest emitting sector, contributing about 14% of Queensland's total emissions. We have a responsibility that we keenly feel to our future generations to examine cleaner, greener and more sustainable modes of transport to move people and goods around our state. So to transition the transport sector to a zero carbon future requires a holistic approach, and we're using one which relies on the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework to conceptualise that holistic approach to a zero carbon transport system. And Avoid really means reducing the need to travel, shifting, talking about greater use of more efficient modes, and also improving through improving the energy efficiency and vehicle technology such as electric vehicles and hydrogen. So there's many benefits to decarbonising that we see, and creating a more sustainable transport system will complement our more traditional objectives of accessibility, efficiency and safety. And we certainly acknowledge that the benefits of a more sustainable transport system include reduced congestion, lower energy costs, reduced imported fuel demand, better air quality, improving overall health and definitely environmental benefits and greater community amenity. So zero emission vehicles will contribute to a significant positive health outcomes. As you're aware, they emit no tailpipe emissions and harmful particulates. And what we can do going forward is support our associated industry and supply chains for opportunities to expand the domestic business and employment. And we're seeing that already in Queensland with businesses supplying and installing charging stations for electric vehicles, manufacturing electric vehicle componentry and systems, research and development, driving innovation, and managing the maintenance of batteries and recycling of parts. So those industries can contribute considerably to economic growth and development. And what we're doing at the moment is we've developed a zero net emissions transport roadmap, which is almost completed, and it really will set a credible pathway for the transport sector to decarbonise by 2050. This roadmap takes a holistic approach, looking at avoiding emissions through reduced trip length, shifting journeys to more efficient modes, and improving technology, as I mentioned, through the use of electric and hydrogen vehicles. And so we're also working on a zero emission vehicle strategy. This is being developed in conjunction with the Department of Energy and Public Works here in Queensland, and it's a collaborative whole of government Queensland approach. And it's importantly vehicle type and fuel agnostic. So in that sense, this strategy has been developed through considerable community feedback with local government, state agencies, industry and interest groups, and also through an industry government partnership through the Queensland Electric Vehicle Committee. That strategy, which will help decarbonise the transport sector, is also expected to go to government by the end of the year. And since the pandemic, we've certainly seen in Queensland that public transport has seen a sharp decline, sadly, in terms of patronage. And that's despite a lot of messaging around cleaning and sanitising and adding extra services to reduce crowding. And we've done some surveys around public transport customer attitudes and behaviours. And while there has been a shift, as you've all appreciated, to working from home, which has had an impact on patronage, 19% of surveys respondents confirmed that they didn't use public transport due to concerns around COVID. So while those results aren't an accurate predictor for the future, we're also looking at, from a policy perspective, how we can, I guess, consider the working from home, whether that's going to be a sticky outcome and people will do that for the longer term, and what industries will recover if there is damage and if that damage is permanent. But that won't stop us in terms of how we consider the ongoing impact of travel demand for public transport. And one thing that we continue to do here in Queensland is put livability at the centre of everything that we do. So in that regard, we're also developing a movement and place framework, which is really guiding transport planning and operational decision making so that we can prioritise placemaking and sustainable forms of transport, walking and cycling, and reduce the impact of transport on Queenslanders in terms of noise and pollution. And as I'm sure you're aware, that concept of movement and place is a keystone consideration in the new Australian infrastructure plan, and it's also something we're focusing heavily on in terms of our state infrastructure strategy, which is currently out for consultation. My branch also undertakes research and development into new and emerging technologies such as automated vehicles and service models that are coming to the fore, which can potentially significantly change how we travel and how we can decarbonise the transport sector. Automated vehicles potentially alter trade-offs for households made between where they choose to live and what their mobility patterns are on a daily basis, and can potentially cut out passenger transport altogether. We're also looking at drones, and some of you may be aware recently Alphabet Wing began a drone-based rooftop delivery service here in Queensland from a shopping centre, and those businesses that are participating include Sushi Hub, Boost Juice, and also pharmacy. So that service is currently delivering to 19 suburbs in Queensland, and in the first 6 weeks of this service, 2,500 contactless drone deliveries were made. So they're removing vehicles from the network. And it would be remiss of me not to mention that in terms of the department itself, we are also tackling climate change to ensure that climate risk and adaptation is addressed organisationally. And we're also looking at how we can manage risk and climate change risk to our assets and services. And we're doing that through an agency-wide climate change risk assessment and management project. And that's going to inform our whole of agency initiatives to better embed climate change risk management in our operations and improve the resilience of our transport system going forward. And I guess lastly, looking forward, which is where we tend to look in my role in terms of strategic policy, we're also considering the important element of the Brisbane's aim to deliver sustainable and resilient Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2032. And in that, we will be delivering a sustainability program that's really grounded in the existing policy framework, setting ambitious Games aspirations and advancing the Australian policy framework and delivery so that we can continue to drive the 50% renewable energy and 30% reduction targets by 2030 and support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And lastly, we are also embedding the future role of hydrogen in transport in Queensland in the context of an emerging local hydrogen industry. And you may have seen that there's been a recent announcement this week in terms of Fortescue Future Industries, who will be developing ammonia-based hydrogen, green hydrogen here in Queensland. And so we will continue working in partnership with other Queensland government agencies to implement the government's vision for renewable hydrogen industry in Queensland by 2030 as part of the Queensland Hydrogen Industry Strategy. So we're identifying opportunities for hydrogen use in heavy vehicles, for example, in road freight and public transport, and looking at the principles for determining refuelling infrastructure requirements, which is also being considered in the strategy I mentioned earlier for zero emission vehicles. So we're constantly looking at battery, electric and hydrogen technologies to support decarbonising the transport sector. And as a Queensland Government agency, we're also trialling 5 hydrogen vehicles at the moment in our fleet. So we've got a lot going on, and hopefully that can confirm to you what Queensland's doing in terms of our attempts to decarbonise the transport sector and work towards those targets I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucinda. You've got so much going on. It's amazing. And of course you've got such a huge state as well to deal with. I just love the ambition for the Olympics. The announcement from Fortescue is incredible, and getting your lunch delivered by a drone, I think that's an incredible initiative as well. So I look forward to talking a little bit more about this in a minute. So thanks, Lucinda. So maybe, Walter, you can give us a few opening remarks.
Sure, thanks, David. So I'm going to speak from the viewpoint of a researcher who's based in a large Asian city, which is Singapore. And I think in general, we want to get transport policies and decisions right in cities because that's going to be one of the keys to decarbonization. And if you look at cities globally, it's very obvious there is a huge gap in transport mode choices. Generally speaking, North American cities have got public transport mode choices in the single digits. Most people make their journeys to work on a daily basis using private transport. In a lot of European cities, you've got some parity between public and private transport. And when you go to the Asian cities, and as well as some of the leading global cities like Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore, it's only then that you have public transport as the dominant mode. And I think that's really going to be the key thing we have to worry about. How do we get more cities shifting away from private transport as the dominant mode towards public transport as the main way that people get to work, go to play and so on? So I think there are a few key related challenges from the viewpoint of urban and transport economics that I like to think about to frame the problem. First, I think there's the challenge of land use and infrastructure, and this is an interdependent problem. The economics of public transport basically favor high land use intensity, and that's because they're very large economies of scale, especially for rail transport. You cannot financially support rail investments without lots of people using it on a daily basis. And in turn, it's the development of high-capacity public transport links that actually drives land use intensity. So you also cannot support high-density central business districts or even high-density public housing developments without this kind of high-capacity public transport links. And I think the challenge here is how do we shape and change urban land use patterns. Because when you look at those cities I talked about earlier with very low public transport usage, the reason is those cities are adapted for car use, or they were developed with very poor urban planning principles or no urban planning principles in mind. And it's going to be very difficult to change the land use patterns of those cities overnight or even just in a decade or two. You're going to need massive investments, not just to develop public transport infrastructure, but also to rebuild parts of those cities to adapt them for high density land use. Otherwise, the public transport investment will be wasted. And you've got to figure out a way of unlocking economic value add and using that economic value add to actually pay for some of these investments. And I think, in that we'll talk a bit more about that later, but one good example would be places like Hong Kong, which have made use of the land value uplift created by developing heavy rail transport to finance the same heavy rail transport like MTR. The other big area I think we can talk about is transport choice. So, people take the transport mode that suits their needs best and delivers the most value to them. Because of the cost and benefits. People don't take public transport or take cars because they love doing so, right? It's basically a derived demand. It fulfills a purpose. And I think the key challenge here is going to be thinking about how to make public transport competitive with private cars, private transport, in an era of rising affluence, especially in many developing countries and cities. The problem is that in too many cities around the world, public transport is endured by commuters rather than it being their preferred mode of choice. And as affluence goes up, you see those commuters shifting towards private transport. It may not be cars, but they shift towards motorcycles and so on, which have their own, implications for urban life quality and so on. So I think, just some closing views on this for now. I think the solution, especially in developing Asian cities, is to get in as early as possible with these major policy changes and frameworks. Because the problem is, when you look around in Asia, a lot of cities are heading down the same path as those North American cities where public transport is very likely to suffer from chronic underinvestment. It's not going to be the preferred choice because of the private decisions made by land developers and individuals. They're basically choosing what works for them, and what works for them is a less intensive kind of urban sprawl form of development. And I think in the near term, the problem is the lack of budget. There's no money to transform these developing Asian cities and to install high quality public transport infrastructure. So we really need to figure out how to develop, how to provide financing development packages, ways to unlock some of the land value that will be created through public transport developments that will help both decarbonization as well as help these cities develop. So I think that's it for now, and we'll talk more about it later.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Walter. Your comments are around unlocking value from land to pay for some of this infrastructure is very important, but very hard to do. And I also love your comment about people thinking about public transport as something that gets in the way of private transport rather than a preferred mode of travel. So shifting that thinking is really important. So we'll come back to you later, Walter, in the discussion. So finally, Jen, a few thoughts from you.
Sure, thanks, David. I think that was really interesting hearing Walter, and the challenges obviously vary depending on where you are. Population distribution and urban form and socioeconomic factors can make it easier or harder to implement certain strategies. But I think wherever you are, the main ingredients of an emission reduction strategy are really similar. You mentioned I'd spent the last couple of years developing the South Australian Government's Climate Change Action Plan. We spent a lot of time looking at transport, which is our biggest source of emissions in South Australia. And we essentially boiled it down to 3 key actions. Support the uptake of low and zero emission vehicles and fuels, increase the use of public transport and active travel, and align transport and urban planning with low emission transport outcomes. So all of those sort of focus areas have their own challenges. I feel that the transition to EV should intuitively be the most straightforward, and we are starting to see progress there. We're electrifying more of our rail network slowly but surely. We've got a clear policy direction now for all new government fleet vehicles to be plug-in electric. We're cost effective and fit for purpose. But it takes time. My team's currently working with the property division to iron out all those issues and unknowns and getting EV charging infrastructure installed at government sites to facilitate that transition. And that's just for the government fleet. That issue is obviously much bigger and more complex when you're looking at how best to convert a public transport fleet. Decisions about the charging strategy, whether to go for overnight charging at depots or opportunity charging at layovers, all those decisions have quite big implications for battery size, weight, battery life. Adelaide's buses have to travel fairly long distances to service the outer suburbs. They've got high air conditioning loads, so finding a manufacturer who can deliver a bus that suits our route profile and climate and so on, it's not a simple exercise. We've been trialling some locally manufactured electric buses in the last year or so that's starting to give us some useful information that will help us with our roadmap to transitioning. So on the second one, so looking at increasing use of public transport and active travel, that's not a new challenge for anyone. I think you can go back to pretty much any strategic transport and land use planning document from the last 20 years, and there'll be a goal in there to increase the proportion of trips made by those modes. It ticks so many boxes, not just emissions reduction, but the social benefits, less pollution, more exercise, plus less of our city devoted to roads and car parks, which are really expensive to build and maintain in terms of dollars as well as carbon, and which are huge contributors to the urban heat island effect. But despite all those benefits, in Adelaide, we're still struggling to hit 10% of workday trips on public transport. Our public transport authority here is in the process of reforming the public transport system to try and make the services more efficient, more integrated and more customer focused. And they are doing a huge amount of work to improve ticketing, access to real-time information. We're expanding many of our park and ride facilities, trialling on-demand public transport services in the outer metro areas. But without financial disincentives to driving and parking in the CBD, I feel that it will remain a challenge to get people to change their travel behaviours. Just on the last one I mentioned, it was aligning transport planning with our net zero goals. So last year, following the release of the Climate Works report about reshaping infrastructure for a net zero future, we engaged Climate Works to have a look at DITs and the government's infrastructure planning and investment frameworks and make some recommendations for how we can better align them with the net zero emission goals. We were trying to understand why our processes and frameworks are leading us to invest disproportionately, I would say, in road projects that facilitate private vehicle use instead of projects that are more closely aligned with our objectives of increasing public transport and active travel. So when you look at our transport model and the assessment frameworks that we're using to build business cases for transport infrastructure projects, it's not surprising that we keep investing in roads. Our current transport model is based on historical patterns of travel behaviour and mode share. So it's assuming little change in those variables over the next 30 years. So basically, when we look at a road segment, we assume constant or increased vehicles per day, which results in favourable BCRs for projects that reduce travel time for private vehicle users, and that effectively justifies continued investment in projects that increase road capacity, like duplications, intersection widening, which seem to be at odds with our net zero goals. By the same token, those transport models assume limited growth in public transport use and active travel. So the benefits from improved public transport infrastructure only get multiplied by a relatively small number of users, and the BCRs tend to be weaker. So one of the outcomes of the Climate Works review was for us to develop some net zero transport scenarios for South Australia, and then to use those to, well, firstly recommend updates to our transport model, the inputs and outputs, and secondly, to help us make more informed decisions about which projects we invest in based on scenario analysis. So looking at how those solutions or options perform under different variables. So again, it's not a simple task. It's really quite difficult to get your head around what infrastructure we will be going to need to meet future transport demands, especially when things are changing so quickly with increased working from home, changing our travel patterns, or the introduction of autonomous vehicles, rideshare services, and so on. So lots of challenges, but it's a really interesting space, and I think we've all got our heads in the right space. We're ready to take those challenges on.
Okay, thanks, Jen. That was really insightful. It's quite interesting, isn't it, with a relatively small city like Adelaide, sometimes described as one of the most livable cities in Australia, to get people to change behaviours is quite hard. And your comments around, the return on investment and actually changing the way governments make these decisions. Of course, there's always a political element in all of this. If we can get some shift in the politics, as well as changing some of the policies, we may get quicker movements in these decisions. So maybe we'll go to a few questions. I've got a few questions that we might ask, but first of all, Lucinda, we might just kick off with you. There was a question from Joel around the Fortescue announcement. It's interesting, isn't it? Because he's talking about manufacturing equipment all over the world, including Queensland, and it was a great announcement for your state. Do you think this is a big opportunity for jobs in your state? And what does it mean for the transformation for other industries like coal into new industries like Twiggy's announcement may create for those workers who are concerned about their future?
Thanks for the question, Joel. I think it's a really great one. So I guess, for Queensland, it is a huge opportunity and really welcomed. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a Queensland hydrogen strategy, a 10-year strategy, and that really is looking to encourage hydrogen within our production within Queensland. In terms of manufacturing and jobs, it will certainly lead to different jobs and greater employment opportunities. And I noticed yesterday during the press conference, both Incitec and Twiggy were mentioning that they will certainly look towards retraining and bringing people along so that they have an opportunity to upskill, but also that there is a huge opportunity for new skills and new training and new opportunities. So I think it's a huge bonus for Queensland. Very happy about it.
Thanks for that, Lucinda. So, Walter, I was just wondering about responsibility. What do you think about the responsibility? Does it lie with government? Does it lie with private companies or individuals? Is there a pecking order in that decision about whose responsibility this is, or is there an order in which these things might happen? Do we need to see greater action from governments first?
Yeah, thanks, David, for that question. I think the answer is that it's all three, and I think the order would roughly follow in what you laid out, which is governments, private companies, and the individuals. And I think the reason for that is when you look at governments, I think a framework, a policy framework is actually critical for addressing the external costs of high carbon forms of transport. And I think this means incentivizing the shift towards low carbon forms of transport, incentivizing, for example, or making it easier to do land use redevelopment that favors public transport. But I think also very crucially, and this is especially the case in a lot of developing countries, making sure that you disincentivize high carbon transport and inefficient land use forms. And this is really a big challenge because I think we all know that voters don't like to pay high prices for fossil fuels or at the petrol pump, and as a result of that, it's been a common policy in so many countries throughout the world to either tax fossil fuels at extremely low rates, or even worse, to actually subsidize the use of fossil fuels. So these kinds of policies would have to slow down and stop as soon as possible in order to actually have a meaningful shift. But then when you look at private industry, it's actually going to be private industry which will have to do all of the heavy lifting in actually developing the latest technologies, to make low carbon forms of transport actually feasible, right? From a financial perspective, as well as to, of course, actually build that infrastructure out, as well as to provide all of the vehicles and so on. I mean, if you look at EVs, cost parity of EVs with with internal combustion vehicles, currently they're not at cost parity, and that's where you need the government subsidies and incentives in order to make them more at cost parity. But in the long run, it will not be the government subsidies that actually make EVs cost competitive. It will be the continuing technological development by private companies who are interested in beating each other and trying to gain more market share. That's what's actually necessary to to make this low carbon transport infrastructure more feasible. And finally, from individuals, I think individuals here, of course, have to be open to changing their lifestyle a bit. But I think it comes back down to making low carbon forms of transport preferred rather than something that people feel they have to endure. And that's why, you have to have the government framework, you have to have private industry working to make low carbon forms of transport more cost competitive. Otherwise, you won't get that. But that being said, I think in the near term, there is a bit of room here for government to work with and industry to work with private individuals to educate them about the low carbon alternatives. I mean, just in Singapore where I live, there's still a lot of misconceptions about EVs today. So quite apart from the cost differential, people have concerns like whether EVs will, catch on fire and explode. People have concerns about, do you need to plug it in every single night? Otherwise, you're going to wake up to a dead battery. So there's all this lack of understanding of what EVs actually are, where maybe there's some room for more consumer education. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah. So it's a combined responsibility, isn't it, to take this on board? So Jen, what would you like to see from the Australian government? Well, first of all, a couple of announcements would be good, but from the Australian government in terms of policy that might encourage the use of EVs. There is some concern in South Australia, for example. They're talking about taxing electric vehicles in the future to offset the fuel tax, which is concerning. So what would you like to see the federal government do to encourage the use of EVs?
Yeah, I think the role for the federal government will be around introducing vehicle emission standards. I think that will really help drive increased uptake of EVs. Your comment about the road user charge, I disagree with. I think we need to ensure that all vehicle owners, regardless of what car they're driving, contribute to the upkeep of our roads. And I don't think that policy is designed to unfairly, impact on EV owners at all. Our government's done some analysis, and you'd still be better off with your registration charges owning an EV than a four-cylinder ICE car. But I think, subsidies for EV purchases were at least, until the price of EVs come down, would be helpful, just to make that decision a bit easier for private vehicle owners. I think also just the fleet managers can play a huge role there. So having EV policies that are, at a corporate level, and government's starting to take the lead there, that will create flow-on effects for the second-hand EV market, which will be really impactful, I think.
Lucinda, have you got any thoughts on this?
Certainly have. I'm just nodding away here to everything that Jen is saying. So totally agree, Jen. I think certainly in the work that we've been doing for our zero emission vehicle strategy, while that is, as I mentioned earlier, fuel and vehicle agnostic, we are certainly encouraging greater electric vehicle uptake through that. And while it is not yet approved by government, certainly some of the research that we've undertaken and the community feedback that we had, the initial and most resilient barrier, I guess, is the price of vehicles. So I know other states have brought in subsidies to support that, I guess, uptake, so that people have a little bit of a nudge, if you like, to purchasing. But certainly we've found too that consumer education and awareness, as Walter mentioned, is very, very important. It's also a barrier if people don't understand the benefits and how an EV can operate. And certainly one of the things that our government has done is invested in the Queensland Electric Superhighway, which is the longest electric vehicle highway in a state in Australia. And that's proven to be very good in encouraging uptake and awareness about how to recharge and to really address that issue around range anxiety, which is another big issue. And certainly through our strategy, we're also looking at how we can assist people in their awareness about when to recharge at home or at work, so that we can also reduce energy emissions and get people's behaviour to charge at a time that's best for the electricity system and therefore the environment as well. So, yeah, totally agree. And I think electric vehicles are a really key part of decarbonising, while the hydrogen sector is really starting to ramp up and mature.
Yeah. So, Walter, it's interesting in Australia, the uptake of electric vehicles is slow compared to Europe. What's it like in Asia? Is there, standouts in Asia? Are there cities or countries that are doing it really well? And is there any policies that you know of that are working to drive that change?
Well, first, I think, in the broad policy spectrum, right, between electric vehicles and public transport, I think public transport is still the one that a lot of developing Asian cities should actually focus their attention on over just converting people from private vehicles to EVs, because, it's still going to be public transport, which is the game changer, I think, for decarbonization. But then when we talk about EVs in general, I think again here as well, it's important to differentiate between the kinds of EV shifts that we see in highly developed economies like like Western Europe and North America, where people are buying luxury EVs like Teslas, and some of the nicer models that are brought up by the traditional car manufacturers, and the kinds of electrification that we actually see going on, which is suited for more developing cities in Asia. So here I'm thinking about places like China, where actually one of the large shifts in electrification, which is I think somewhat unnoticed by many observers outside that area, is actually the shift towards electrified personal mobility devices and e-scooters, which in the context of a high density city, if you have the right infrastructure for that, it's actually a superior mode choice for a lot of daily commute choices. If your daily commute is a couple of kilometers in distance and you have the the road or pathway infrastructure to support it, converting to an e-scooter, a personal mobility device, is probably going to meet your needs a lot better than buying an EV, which you probably can't afford it anyway. You see, so I think that's what we have to be thinking about. I think for a lot of the developing cities, first is public transport, but second, I think it's facilitating the shift for people whose needs are not met by public transport yet towards electrified light mobility. So it's not about getting them to, replace their car with an EV, because many of them don't even own a car in the first place. It's about changing them their choice from buying a polluting motorcycle to buying an electric motorcycle, electric personal mobility device, and so on. So I think that's going to be very useful. But again, it's something which is not, which doesn't really enter the decision framework for policymakers in highly developed Western economies, because most people there don't, even own these kinds of motorcycles and so on in the first instance, because they've passed that point already in terms of affluence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great, Walter. So there's a question from Natalie, and also maybe a thought, Jen, around trying to come up with the perfect policy. And this is an issue, I think, across Australia. Are we trying to drive to perfection, or should we be taking more risks around, and including things like active transport, the concept of a 15-minute city rather than these big sprawling cities? Can we drive change through perhaps doing some trials, for example, in some locations across Australia, taking some risks in some policy areas, rather than trying to please everyone, which is always going to slow us down in this aspiration to decarbonise transportation?
Yeah, I think trials are a really important part of it, because this is all new technology and new mobility patterns that we are all learning and trying to work out how they're going to fit in. So I mentioned before that the South Australian Public Transport Authority has been doing trials of on-demand public transport services. So for social equity reasons, we need to provide a public transport service for outer metro areas like Mount Barker and the Barossa, but it's not a great outcome to have a fixed timetable bus circling around with very low patronage. So we have been trialling, and I guess the closest thing I can think it resembles is an Uber, but a public transport Uber, and that I think has worked really well. We've now transitioned to a full service, and I hope that those sort of services and more flexible services can be rolled out in future. We're trialling the electric buses to, I guess, rather than wait until we've got our electric bus integration study completely finalised and we've planned out a perfect transition plan, we are going ahead. We've got about 22 hybrid buses in our fleet now. We're trialling fully electric buses just to see what the issues are, so that we can, that will help us determine the best solution for our fleet and our route profiles. So yeah, I think absolutely getting involved in trials is a great way to to step forward while and be able to learn from that experience.
Yeah, it's great to hear that the Uber bus trial is potentially successful, and combining that or making that an electric bus as well, and being subsidised by governments. That model seems to be something that should be pursued, and I hope the trial continues to go well. But perhaps combining that to some with other things like drone transportation. We're doing work with Skyports at the moment in Singapore, which is about bringing aviation closer to cities and closer to hubs, using drones potentially to move people around, and then connecting that with, as you say, Uber buses. Might be a different solution for the future. But I was interested, Lucinda, in your comments around the drones. Perhaps you can, I know I picked up on the sushi, but perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that, and whether you've been thinking about its impact or its potential impact on transportation solutions, combined with other methods of transportation in cities themselves.
Thank you. That's a really good question. Yeah, look, we've been doing a bit of research about drones and what their place would be, both in an urban context and a regional context. And Queensland is quite dispersed compared to other states. So it was very interesting to look at an SEQ, Southeast Queensland context. And certainly it found that in highly density or highly dense or more compact urban areas, drones would be used quite regularly, whereas further out it may have a better opportunity in terms of decarbonising the transport system, and those sort of peri-urbans would be extremely beneficial for drone use. So I think the more compact people have access to services, and therefore drones may not be necessary, but the further out you go, drones have a better application and can provide services to people who may not who would rather get in a car and drive somewhere to get their sushi. A drone can deliver it to them, and so therefore that's taking that vehicle off the road, and it also has safety implications. But certainly, drones are one part. To answer the other part of your question, in terms of other forms, we have a walking strategy and a cycling strategy, and both of those are very important in terms of zero emission journeys that we're encouraging through our zero emission vehicle strategy as well. So we're focusing on opportunities to look at journey types and how we can encourage better active transport and get people into cycling and walking more. And one of the questions that I received through the chat was around, has COVID enabled that sort of activity? Certainly has, and we've really leveraged from that and the working from home phenomena, and found that there's been a shift in behaviour to the use of things like e-scooters instead of vehicles, where they are being used to do those shorter trips. So yes, drones and other technologies, as well as active transport, has a huge role to play going forward.
Yeah, so there's a comment here from Edward just saying, will drones be a solution, or could they be a problem? Will it lead to single occupancy vehicles in the sky? Will we each have a drone? So these things are interesting. Who knows what the outcomes might be, but I do like the option of doing trials. We have to try these things, and we have to try a lot of different things if we're going to get a change in outcome. So just on that, just before we move away from, we can stay with modes of transport. I was interested in different fuels. This is a question to any of the panelists. Have you done in any of your research much work on the different types of fuels? Everyone's talking about green hydrogen, clearly, electricity. Is there a silver bullet here, and what does it look like? And actually reaching into the future, are there other things that are being considered? So anyone on the panel? Jen, do you want to kick it off?
This is an area that our Department for Energy and Mining have really taken the lead on, but DIT has a supporting role. I think transitioning to low emission fuels is going to obviously play a huge role in decarbonising the transport sector, particularly in South Australia, where our grid is rapidly decarbonising. So we're aiming to have a net zero grid by 2030. So the abatement opportunity presented by that transition to EVs is huge. So Department for Energy and Mining released the EV Action Plan last year, so that is really aiming to create the right conditions to facilitate uptake and removing barriers to range anxiety by investing in or trying to leverage private investment, I should say, in the statewide charging network. In terms of hydrogen, I think hydrogen will play a role in decarbonising the transport sector. I think it's more likely to be relevant to heavy vehicles. So again, this isn't my area of expertise, but I do know the government has been supporting several projects to develop the local hydrogen industry. We've got the hydrogen park in Tonsley, which is producing hydrogen mainly to feed into the local domestic gas network, but it also has a compressed hydrogen tube trailer which allows it to be transported to potential refuelling sites. And we are doing a hydrogen for refuelling study at the moment, just looking at options for establishing hydrogen bus refuelling in Adelaide. My understanding at this stage is that it's just the long distance haulage makes it cost prohibitive at the moment. So as long as the refuelling site is very close to the production site, it's not too bad, but it's just a really low payload. So that's a big barrier that we need to overcome for hydrogen vehicles.
Lucinda, anything you can build on there in terms of your research?
Certainly, look, we're very interested, as I said, in looking into hydrogen. A lot of trials are really essential, and we're looking to progress those through our zero emission vehicle strategy. And certainly, while there are other departments who focus solely on hydrogen. From a transport and decarbonising opportunity for the sector, we're really keen to see hydrogen, as Jen mentioned as well, in that long-haul freight opportunity, and to see the industry mature to be able to really take advantage of that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There's a question or a comment here from Christine. She's talking about whether during tender processes we could ask potential partners to bring forward innovations on projects. There's a lot of significant metro work being undertaken across Asia Pacific, including Australia, of course, in Singapore and Hong Kong as well. And it'd be nice to think that in years to come, proponents could bring forward new technologies for consideration as part of the tender process. But that's quite innovative, and we all have standards. All governments have standards that they want people to follow. So changing sort of that tender framework and taking a risk again to introduce new innovations is quite tricky. Walter, do you have any thoughts on this or comments?
You mean on the use of how to adapt our policies for the use of technology to incentivize innovation, right? Yeah. I think in general, and this relates to the earlier point on what kind of technologies we should be adopting for decarbonization. I think the important thing here is to not let perfect be the enemy of the good, so to speak. And the example I have in mind here is actually for Singapore, where Singapore has actually been criticized by a number of people. Both within and outside, for actually being fairly slow in terms of getting on board with the electrification bandwagon. And I think part of the reason why we are a bit slow compared to, for example, some of the leading European countries like Norway in particular, is that I think for a long time, the government was actually trying to figure out what is the perfect solution. When you look at some of the technical studies the government commissioned in the early 2010s about, what's the future of low carbon transport going to be, there was a lot of debate back then about how would the cost structure of battery-based electrification evolve versus hydrogen solutions. And so that's why the government was very cautious to make any sort of commitment, because it wasn't clear for much of the mid-2010s where things were going to actually play out. But of course, as we've seen in the last couple of years, it's now obvious that battery-based electrification is going to be the dominant choice, at least probably for the next decade, maybe a bit longer, for light to medium vehicles, although there is very much this question about whether it's suitable for heavy vehicles. And so, if as a policymaker, if you are always trying to figure out, if you have the mindset that you don't want to make a decision until it becomes entirely obvious which way things are going to go, then of course, you're committing the error of just waiting for the perfect solution there. And I think that's going to be a big problem. But that being said, I think it is also important to not move too early, perhaps. And I think this is especially the case for a small country or a developing country, because if you do move too early, then you might have a lot of your investments, tied up in technologies which end up being not, they end up not being actually the standard going forward. So I think CHAdeMO is a good example of that. It's very likely that all of the investments tied up in CHAdeMO charges are going to be completely wasted, because nobody is following that standard anymore, even Nissan, for example. So, it's about getting the timing right. And for a smaller country, I think there's probably more sense in waiting a bit longer, because you won't be able to drive the standards development, unlike the EU or China, the US, for example.
Yeah.
David, I might just add something to that, just before we move off the tenders and procurement. I think one of the focus areas of our climate change action plan is looking at driving better climate outcomes through government procurement. When you think of all of the things that we've purchased, we've really got a lot of procurement power to drive change in materials and technologies. So I've been working with a cross-agency group on government's greenhouse gas inventory, which is a mammoth task, and it really has started to highlight where our biggest sources of emissions are. And in so many cases, as we move to privatise certain services like public transport or building facilities management, whereas once we owned the vehicle fleets that were driving around the road network or servicing government facilities, now that is being contracted out to the likes of Ventia or Downer or Fulton Hogan, those service providers. So it's really highlighting the need for us to include appropriate requirements in our tenders and our contracts to make sure that we can collect that information on emissions associated with delivering those services, which are essentially government's emissions. They just happen to be Scope 3 delivered on our behalf, and also to request an emission reduction plan that's aligned with our targets. So that's what we're starting to work with our procurement teams to identify those procurements that will generate emissions that are within our emissions boundary, those material Scope 3 sources, and then if they are within our boundary, mandating the requirement to be able to report those emissions and to show us how they're going to reduce them over time. And I think the next step will be introducing a consistent way of evaluating the approach in tenders to incentivise low carbon solutions.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. I think this is a place where governments or government departments can make a huge step change by working with the industry. Where Mott MacDonald's carbon neutral, very proud of that, and I think everyone that works for any government should have an aspiration to get there or a roadmap to get there before it can undertake work. So I think that is a policy change that actually people on this call like you and Lucinda and Walter and others who are very much involved with governments can push hard for and actually make a real change, because it can draw in so many people that provide services to government.
Yeah. I mean, we don't think twice about making it a pre-qualification requirement to have an accredited environment management system. Then the next step, I think, is to make it a requirement. If you want to provide services to government, you need to have, science-based targets for your organisation, or you need to be able to supply carbon neutral material, whatever it might be. I mean, it will depend on the procurement, but I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, it was interesting right at the beginning of this discussion. Scott asked a question of Akil about the UK government's foreign policy in terms of trade with Australia. It's the same sort of concept. They should be requiring Australia to set explicit goals, and I'm hoping that we'll find out about that in the next couple of weeks. And I was pleased to hear that Prince Charles is asking our Prime Minister to go to COP26. We'll see what happens, given that he's been on the media this morning questioning why he might not go. We need all our leaders there to make some of these decisions. Just on the building of roads, it's interesting. There's a lot of big roads being built around Australia, and also there are some in Asia, but not so many. How do we change the shift in thinking away from roads to public transport? And I know it's very political, but what policies are you thinking about, Lucinda and Jen, in particular, to get this shift?
I'll kick off if you like, Jen. Certainly, we're doing quite a bit of research around future and emerging technologies which might drive that shift, and how to leverage from some of those opportunities and mitigate those challenges. As I mentioned earlier, the department has a walking and cycling strategy, which has really been beneficial, particularly given the shift from public transport during COVID, and a lot more of that walking, cycling and micro-mobility happening. We're looking at, I guess, how we can influence travel behaviours. So we can look at rideshare and micro-mobility. We're also looking at mobility as a service, which is on-demand transport, and growing that part of the passenger transport mix. We also look at using that mass concept based on integrating public and private transport through that common digital interface into a one-stop shop as a way of really getting cars off the road and reducing congestion and cutting emissions. We also do a bit of research in terms of how do we create a shift in behaviour. So we look at nudging techniques, and we engage with academic institutions here in Queensland and work with students around thinking about how we can nudge people to look at that first and last mile, for example, and how we can get people to public transport and then off public transport and home, addressing those two components of first and last mile, which has been really beneficial. And then how we can build that into a customer focus to support people to make that shift. It is very hard. We acknowledge that it does take stages, and depending on, as Walter alluded to earlier, where people are and in what way they use transport and for what purpose, it can be difficult to shift people, but it's really, really important. And I think just with the half glass full approach, I think commuters are being much more aware of their emission generating journeys, and there's I guess a collective awareness that's growing around what people can do. So combined with nudging a bit, I'm hopeful we can get more people on public transport and out of cars. And as I've mentioned earlier, we've got opportunities with electric vehicles and so on that are happening, and micromobility. So there is a shift occurring.
That's good. Jen?
Yeah, look, I mentioned earlier the work that we're doing currently on developing the net zero transport scenarios. The whole idea there is to help us make investment decisions that are better aligned with our net zero goals. So to question continued investment in infrastructure that facilitates private vehicle use. Walter made the comment that people, might have to endure public transport rather than it be a mode of choice. I think every time we make it easier for someone to drive their car into the city, then we're making the job harder for ourselves to get them to take a bus or a train. So I'm really hopeful that work will help our decision makers look at investments in in transport infrastructure through the lens of our net zero goals. One other thing I'm keen to mention is that we're always focused on the enabled emissions of transport infrastructure, so the emissions of the vehicles using the infrastructure, but we can't forget the embodied and operational emissions. Building and maintaining roads is incredibly carbon intensive. So one of the things I've been advocating for is to update the externality values used in ATAP, so the Australian Transport Assessment and Planning Guidelines, to ensure that decision makers are provided with information on the embodied and operational carbon associated with different options that might be presented as solutions to whatever transport problem we're trying to solve, and take that into account, that carbon into account when they're assessing and ranking the different options. I think the ATAP guidelines currently assign $60 a tonne for enabled emissions, but they don't provide a framework for us to estimate embodied and operational emissions. So I think that's a real area for improvement.
Yeah, that's right, Jen. We are finding our clients who we're helping to understand their carbon footprint and get to net zero eventually. They miss the whole concept of embodied energy, and it's just as important. And of course, in the transportation sector, the infrastructure we're building is very heavy on embodied energy. So this has a very important part to play as well. So Walter, I just want to ask about research and the academics in our world. What do you think they could be focusing on in particular to help us with the decarbonisation of transportation? And there's been a few comments in the chat box about also education of younger people, both at schools and universities, to get a groundswell of influence early on. How can we achieve that as well?
Okay, well, First, I guess I think some of the most important research that's going to be necessary is beyond my ken, but that basically has to do with research that helps to drive down the costs of of low carbon intensity transport, so as to make it more affordable and more financially viable for all cities people to adopt that. But that's an engineering question and not something I'm so familiar with. But what I think I am more familiar with is the need for research that actually looks at at transport behaviors and choices that are made by individuals, especially in cities and in contexts where transport choices are very high carbon or very polluting, and tries to understand how do you really adapt local policies to make it easier for those individuals to shift their transport choices. And I think there are a lot of big gaps there. And I mean, just to give one illustration of a problem in Singapore, we a couple of years ago, this wave of personal mobility devices, electrified personal mobility devices, hit Singapore. And the challenge there is, although as a city, we recognize the value that personal mobility devices would have for, for helping to shift transport away from motorized traffic towards, what is actually a very low carbon transport choice. The problem is we didn't understand at the time that they were introduced the impact that it would have on society, and in particular the impact it would have on pedestrians, because most of the users of personal mobility devices chose to use their vehicles on pedestrian pathways, and this is also because our early reaction was to ban them from the road infrastructure, because we feared PMD vehicle conflicts, which would kill a lot of PMD users inevitably. But of course, when you shift them to the pedestrian path infrastructure, what do you end up with? You end up with pedestrians actually being killed instead of PMD users, which happened in a number of cases. And I think our failure to anticipate that and to understand that a proper regulatory and educational framework was in place for the users as well as the pedestrians, that led after a number of months of increasing conflict between PMD users and pedestrians, that led to the policy decision to just ban them as well outright from most pedestrian footpaths. And so now we are at a situation where personal mobility devices in Singapore are more or less effectively banned. They're legal to own, but they're not legal to operate on a lot of the paths in Singapore, which means that it's not so easy for people to actually use them to get around. And we are now scrambling to develop a proper infrastructure for usage of personal mobility devices. But again, the gaps here are just in understanding the conflicts that they would cause with pedestrians, understanding the kinds of local infrastructure that would replace roads and pathways that are suitable for both personal mobility devices and pedestrians. So there are all these gaps there in our research, which we should have actually undertaken, but we didn't have the time to. And I think going forward, in terms of the role for education, some of these, new technologies and new transport modes are going to require people to change the way that they actually get about. It's going to require people to develop new behaviors, right? New modes of navigating pedestrian pathways where you're more aware of your surroundings and aware of the fact that there are higher speed users nearby, like personal mobility devices. And all of this, I think, is there's a lot of room here, I think, for public education and dialogue on what the proper behaviors should be going forward.
Yeah, no, that's great. So just a question for you, Jen, just changing subject. Oh, no, sorry, Lucinda. You can comment as well if you like, Jen. I was going to ask Lucinda about the Olympics. Here we are, 2032, I think it is, just over 10 years. What's the aspiration? What can be achieved? Can it be a showcase to the world of what Queensland can do and what Australia can do? It's a great opportunity really to do something special, especially around the transportation and the movement of people.
Thank you, absolutely. And look, legacy really is central to guiding the objective for the Brisbane 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. There's no doubt that the large-scale infrastructure investment for the Games provides an opportunity to create venues and precincts that contribute to Queensland's long-term livability, but certainly that will involve improving the integration of transport network with those everyday activities for Queenslanders. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we're working on a movement and place framework, so that will help us to better plan and design and operate Olympic-related infrastructure that will create a lasting legacy for Queensland and Brisbane. And in that, we will also be delivering a sustainability program that's grounded in the existing policy framework, but really setting some ambitious game-specific aspirations. And in terms of the policy context highlights, I guess the Queensland Transport Strategy, which is a strategy that our department has developed, and it has a 30-year vision, and it really is talking about establishing an inclusive and sustainable integrated transport network. And as I mentioned earlier, the Queensland Government's Zero Net Emissions Transport Roadmap, which really looks at business cases that define both cost, social, environmental benefits from implementing various business cases to support a zero net emissions outcome, will include a range of land uses and transport planning initiatives to reduce emissions. We've also, as I mentioned, the zero emission vehicle strategy was based on our initial strategy, which was the Future is Electric, which was Queensland's first electric vehicle strategy, and that was creating a shift to a greener, cleaner sort of fleet. So we're hoping with that foundation and the combined Queensland Electric Superhighway, as well as the other strategies around cycling and walking that I've already mentioned, that will really combine, promote opportunities to have zero emission vehicle use and increase in uptake, but also zero emission journeys through their active transport mode. Certainly mobility is a really big focus area of our sustainability program, and that will be deeply integrated across Brisbane in our 2032 transport task, so that we can ensure there's safe, secure, accessible, seamless and low emission journeys. So what we're really looking at in terms of that context is having all games fleet vehicles being electric, with an ambition to extend this to buses and trucks and charge from 100% renewable energy. We're also looking at having public and active spectator transport to venues over the Games period, capturing 90% of that, and also setting really strong targets for the uptake against current baseline sustainable and accessible tourism accreditation in Queensland. So we're really looking at trying to ensure that sustainability program not only leverages from the work that and strategies and policies we've got in place, but also really creates that legacy opportunity for reducing emissions and having a cleaner and greener Queensland in the future.
Yeah, it's a wonderful opportunity, isn't it? And as you say, you've got all these foundations to build on, and then if you can pull it off on the world stage, it'll be great. It'll be interesting to see what we can do about getting people there in a low carbon way. It might be a bit difficult, but we've got 10 years to do it. Electric aeroplanes or something similar, we might be able to achieve that one day. Jen, I did ask you if you wanted to comment and give some advice to Lucinda on the games, but I think she's got it, by the sounds of it, I think she's got it under control. So we've only got a few minutes left. I'd just like to ask each of you, perhaps starting with Walter, how you're feeling about COP26 and what's been said so far, and what would you like to see, what would be the important outcomes for you from COP26?
Well, I think I have the same hope anytime any of these global discussions on climate change and decarbonization take place, which is I always hope for some kind of global agreement for governments to implement policies that meaningfully shift incentives towards a low carbon future. And, this could mean carbon taxes, it could mean a cut of subsidies for fossil fuel-based infrastructure. But I think what I really hope for is a more concerted agreement on the policies, because if you don't have policy agreement, it's very hard to actually move forward. I think the other thing which I hope for, and this is in the context especially of the Asia Pacific, is for a framework to be developed for development, financing, and technical assistance to developing countries and cities, especially for decarbonization. Because I think one of the key messages here should be that we don't want these places to go down the same, I would say, incorrect paths that many of the cities in the developed world, especially North America, have gone down, which is towards urban sprawl, unsustainable city infrastructure, mass shift towards private transport of affluence. I mean, these are things which you might say would be the natural order of things if you don't worry about, needing a low carbon future. But since we do worry about needing a low carbon future, we need to try to shift the development path of these cities away. But I think it's going to be very hard to happen without some kind of international framework for financing and technical assistance, because these cities have got lots of practical things to worry about, right? Like getting enough public funding to ensure a good quality of life for the citizens. So they need some outside push and assistance, I think, to achieve that low carbon transition.
Yeah, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could help these developing countries and developing cities to be something special in the future in terms of transportation? So Jen, any thoughts on what you would like to see come out of COP26?
Much the same thing. I'm really hoping that the federal government will make that commitment to net zero emissions by 2050, an interim target of 50% by 2030. I do feel that if we get there, then there'll be more pressure or support to use some of the regulatory levers that are available to us to accelerate the change. So rather than relying on technology or policy, looking at those more, stricter or regulatory levers, so emission standards to force the early take-up of technology, possibly parking levies or road user charges, essentially carbon pricing driving that behaviour change. And in that scenario, I think we'd see a more significant shift in travel mode.
Yeah, it's so sad, isn't it, to see politics getting in the way of something we absolutely have to do. So here's hoping over the next couple of weeks. Lucinda, just your thoughts on what you'd like to see? Yep.
I'd certainly echo all of those thoughts. I think adaptation and mitigation are really important. So those emission reduction targets are essential, and also having the conversation about developing nations and how we mobilise finance to support them. But again, really strong commitment so that we can see a consistent approach and desire, and that can filter down into policy, and we can collectively make a big change. So yes, I echo all of those sentiments and remain hopeful.
Yeah. All right, so I might draw this to a close. I'd like to thank all of you. You've been wonderful. You know a lot more about this subject than I do. And I just hope, as I said before, that we get some fantastic outcomes from COP. But, just having these conversations and having these forums and to see the intensity of discussion at the moment is absolutely brilliant. And people are getting this, people say, oh, we're sick of COP26. Well, that's good, because if people are getting sick of it, at least we're getting some messages home to people about what needs to be done. I just hope that the politicians can actually live up to what some of the business leaders are doing. I know we all call him Twiggy, but Fortescue are doing amazing things. His commitment is incredible. There are a lot of businesses around the Asia Pacific region who are making significant commitments to achieving these goals. There are a lot of countries that are doing it, and in fact states in Australia that are making those commitments. I just wish the Australian federal government would get on with it as well. Again, I'd like to thank you all and Akil for giving us a glimpse into what the UK government's doing. I think their leadership for COP26 so far, and we're not even there, has been brilliant. And to hear his thoughts around the framework for decarbonising transportation was really insightful. So, and as he said, I understand there is a transportation day at COP26, and Mont McDonald will be participating in that. So thank you very much. We're just a little bit ahead of time. Thanks to Chelsea. Chelsea's behind the scenes doing the presentation. She organised all of us to participate in this discussion today. So I thank her for arranging it, and I really enjoyed it. So Thanks to everyone, and thank everyone on the call that actually popped the questions in and participated in the discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thanks very much. See you.